Welcome, everybody, to the eighth episode of Stories from the Last Territory, a podcast that covers the golden years of wrestling in Puerto Rico. My name is Luis Cuevas, better known as the Caveman, and I am your host for this trip back in time to the greatest feuds in the history of the island of Puerto Rico. If you like what you hear and see, please subscribe to this YouTube channel or go in audio to Spotify and look for it as Stories from the Last Territories. Before I start, I want to thank fellow historian Juan Gonzalez for his incredible help in this episode. Without him, it would have been almost impossible for me to fill some of the small details that made this episode possible. My first thought when I was thinking about doing an episode was to talk about the Stan Hansen versus Carlos Colon feud. But before I did that, I realized it was important to talk about the Hansen and Brody feud versus Carlos Colon that led to the union of Carlos and Abdullah the Butcher in 1984, as this one ties up to the Hansen and Colon feud and the Abdullah versus Bruiser Brody feud that happened in 85 to 87. This feud, or this angle, or this storyline, whatever you want to call it, led to the record attendance for a show in the island in Puerto Rico for anniversary 84, a record that I'm pretty sure will never be broken for a wrestling match in the island. Like I mentioned last time in the our latest episode talking about anniversary 83, this was a very interesting time in Puerto Rico. When the angle happened, WLC was going through a little bit of change. Out were some of the wrestlers that have been in Puerto Rico for a long time. And we're talking about like the Dick Steinburns, the Pierre Martires of the world. And new talent was coming to the island due to Victor Quiñones' involvement. And also two working arrangements during that year, 1984. We started with the ICW of Mario Savoldi and also Southwest Championship Wrestling with Joe Blanchard. Carlos Colon, after almost a year and a half, had finally unified the NWA and World Wrestling Council World Heavyweight title to become the Universal Heavyweight Champion. During this time, they also changed TV recordings away from the studio, from the RFF uh, studio, to the live arena. And the man who had been the voice of Capital Sports Promotion through all his assistant, Riquín Sanchez, was in the process of leaving the company, and Hugo Sabinovich, who into 1983 had been the lead heel manager, had been betrayed by Barrabas and his army, and first became a babyface wrestling Barrabas, and then became the lead announcer and producer of the show. Bruiser Brody came to the island at the beginning of 1984, and he was the first one of the awesome twosome, let's call it that way, just for heck of this episode, that debuted in the island, and he was managed by Barrabas, who had taken over the heel group, and he took the island by storm. He beat everyone along his warpath. Something interesting about Bruiser Brody, as those American fans can understand, was that he was very different from other big heel rule breakers that had come before him. We had like Mongolian Stomper, Enemy Lad, Abdullah the Butcher, Gorilla Monsoon, but Bruiser Brody, as you well know, was very different. Not only was he a big guy, but he could move in that ring like a junior heavyweight, and he moved through all his challengers, and he was fast, and he was just like a hurricane. I mean, that's how impressive he was, and he really caused an impact in the island. He went through all the challengers along the way until he finally came to Carlos Colon and the Universal title. And they had their first title match on the date of March 31st of 1984, where Brody and Carlos had a wild battle that ended in a double DQ. This led to another rematch, but this time with Joe Frazier as a special referee. Yes, Joe Frazier, the former heavyweight champion, came to the island and was a special referee. And that match also ended in a double DQ. But in those matches, something interesting happened. Brody would just eat up Carlos Colon. I mean, Carlos Colon so and so and so. I mean, you could tell that this guy was a different type of challenger that Carlos Colon had ever faced in his life. This led to a chain match, which I was present. And if you go to YouTube, you can see good on myself in TV, sitting next to my grandpa who had a baseball hat on. Sorry, cheap heat. I had to, be a little fan here. And, and and that match was a wild and bloody one. I like that match because it doesn't have the announcers. It's just the live feed from the card. It's interesting in YouTube. They mention it's 85, but it was 84. The reason that besides the fact that I was there, was also that Barrabas and Hugo Sabinovich were in the middle of their feud. As you see them in the ending of the match fighting each other, and Hugo Sabinovich trying to help Carlos Colon. And that happened at the beginning of 1984. And then after that, after he finished that feud, he became the lead announcer. The match was wild. It was a bloody one. The fans were into it. But in my opinion, looking at it, preparing for this podcast, it had a very weak finish. Both of them had 3-3, in the famous chain match, where they touch each corner. And then they were fighting, and Barrabas hit Carlos Colon on the side, and Carlos Colon fell over and hit the fourth corner to defeat Bruiser Brody. Again, it was a very weak finish, but we can understand now as an older people because of the politics that were going on that Bruiser Brody was not going to do a clean job to anybody, not even Carlos Colon, but he's so real good for him. But anyway, so the crowd was super hot, and you guys should check that match out on YouTube. I think it's Carlos Colon versus Bruiser Brody chain match. I cannot remember the date, but I used to remember that there used to be a tag team match somewhere, and during this time period, where Carlos Colon and King Tonga had a tag team match against Abdullah and Bruiser Brody. Where in the middle of the match, something happened between Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher that they came to blows, and Tonga and Carlos Colon were just standing there looking at each other while Abdullah and Brody just start fighting with each other, and they had to be divided by the manager Barrabas, and that planted the seed to what was going to come later. For years, I thought that I saw that, but I couldn't find any evidence of this match actually happened. Well, doing research for this, I just saw an article by Jack O'Shea from Wrestling Scene that confirmed that I was not crazy, that it was not my imagination, that there was actually a tag team match where Carlos Colon and King Tonga fought Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher, and that both rule breakers had a falling out in this match. And that, in my opinion, was the first seed that something was going to come later. But that would not be the end of Carlos Colon's trouble, as Barrabas mentioned that he had another surprise for Carlos Colon, and that turned out to be Stan the Lariat Hansen, who alongside Brody made Carlos their target. And we have to give credit where credit is due. The reason this feud worked the way it worked was because Carlos Colon really sacrificed a lot. He did everything possible in making these two guys look like unbelievable monsters. We knew they were, but if Carlos Colon would had not sailed and take beating after beating and just give up so much of his body to the point where where people were like, "Man, Carlos Colon really cannot beat these two guys." It was not a matter of how, but when they were going to take Carlos Colon out. That's how furious and how much these two guys and how much Carlos Colon made them look like this killer monsters. I mean, he took beating after beating, week after week, with these two guys just having the control. It just looked like there was no escape. Carlos Colon faced these two with very attacking partners, but it seemed when he joined King Tonga that he had found the perfect partner to battle the two giants. And they had this great match in the Pepin Cestero Bayamon. There's a clip of it in YouTube just the ending. And in that match, they took out Tonga and then they injured Carlos Colon in that match. And he was out of action. In storyline, he was recovering from the beating that Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen were giving him. But in reality, he was in Southwest Championship Wrestling with Joe Blanchard, defending the Universal title against the likes of Moondog Spot, Leo Burke, and even Abdullah the Butcher in a big card in August 15. But that's a story for another time. And he also was in some recordings for Mid Atlantic. But he was selling that he was out of the match. The rumor has always been that the main event of Anniversary 84 originally was going to be King Tonga and Carlos Colon against Abdullah the Butcher and Bruiser Brody. But because King Tonga went out drinking one night to a club and he beat up 5 people and 7 policemen, he had to leave the island in the middle of the night. to never come to the island again. Even though there's some cards where they mention him after this, especially in December and January of '85. So now that story, we're gonna have to dig a little bit more into that. But anyway, but he beat up five people and seven policemen in a nightclub in the middle of the night, and he left. And then this is when things got interesting in this feud. Hugo Sabinovich in the program, uh, Superestrellas de la Lucha Libre, had an interview with Carlos Colon, who said that he was tired of these two giants and that he was going to do the unthinkable because sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and that he was going to ask Abdullah the Butcher to be his partner because he felt he was the only one capable to stop him, Brody and Hansen. While Hugo acted all shocked and kind of like, "Are you crazy, Carlos? You know, this guy also hates you with passion after everything that has gone through with both of you. What are you doing?" But Carlos was very dedicated. And remember, Abdullah the Butcher and Bruiser Brody had a fallout in one match in Puerto Rico. So there were those seeds already planted. Next week, they follow Carlos Colon to Atlanta, where he goes to talk with his mortal enemy, Abdullah the Butcher. At first, Abdullah's handler would not let him pass, but Carlos had a briefcase and showed him the money. And of course, money equals power and it opens the doors. When they saw each other, it looked like they were going to fight, but Carlos showed him the money. And after the conversation, and Carlos trying to convince him and trying to convince the handler, Abdullah accepted to make tag team partners with Carlos Colon against Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen for anniversary '84. So the match was set. But can Carlos Colon trust Abdullah? That's the question the announcers were saying. And even Carlos was not sure if that was the case. While the rule breakers were like, "Watch, Carlos, he's going to betray you. You cannot trust Abdullah. Abdullah's a traitor. He betrayed me. He's going to betray you because all he cares is about himself." All this speculation. But where did Abdullah the Butcher stand made the story even more interesting. And Anniversary '84 was a complete success with more than 32,000 people in Iran Bison Stadium to watch this great match. To be fair, there's some controversy of this if this was the real number or not because of the configuration of the stadium. But let's just go with the 32,000 fans because to this day, that is the accepted number. And to this day, it's still the biggest crowd to ever see wrestling in Puerto Rico in one location for a tag team match. And the match was as you expected. 32,000 fans going crazy. Carlos Colon started the match against Bruiser Brody and Abdullah, and they were building into the hot tag to Abdullah the Butcher, and he finally did it. And then the question was, what was going to do Abdullah the Butcher? Was he going to do an Ollie Anderson against Dusty Rose, or was he going to fight Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen? Well, the answer was real quick. Abdullah came in like a madman and just hit Brody left and right, just went crazy on him, and same with Stan Hansen. Finally, Abdullah attacked Colon again, who came in like a house of fire. They did a double team, but in that double team, Bruiser Brody ducked and Carlos Colon hit Abdullah the Butcher. This was the moment of test. What was Abdullah going to do? Was he gonna retaliate against Carlos Colon, or will he just understand that it was a mistake? Well, the answer came real quick. As soon as he was gonna go to Carlos, Bruiser Brody came in, and Abdullah the Butcher attacked Bruiser Brody, and everybody in the audience just, whoo! He's not gonna betray him. He's part of us. Oh, thank God. And the match continued, and the action turned into a brawl with all four fighters slugging at each other. And the referee had to call for the bell because they were going crazy. It was just a wild brawl. They were fighting all over the stadium. There was so much confusion that you couldn't tell who was uh, fighting who into Carlos Colon and Abdullah the Butcher chased them all the way to the dressing room. And then, however, Abdullah started attacking the referee, leaving him all bloody and everything. And then that was the first match. And that led to a lumberjack match that happened also in Juan Ramon Lobriel Stadium in October 13, 1984. where they had lumberjacks around the ring. And this is a match that is still on YouTube. You could check it out. It explains a little bit of how the Carlos Colon and Abdullah the Butcher became a tag team, so you can see a little bit of that. But also, this match was really good. It was a wild brawl. And at the end, when Carlos Colon had the Brew Breakers right where they wanted, Super Medic interfere when the babyfaces were in control to cause the DQ. But the match did not end there, as from that moment on, it turned into one of the greatest brawls in the history of Puerto Rico. As the Lumberjacks and both tag teams fought all over the stadium, Colon grabbed a nightstick from one of the policemen and started hitting Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen with them. They went to the dressing room, fall all over the dressing room. There's even a funny scene as they go to the bathroom and they caught Tom Renesto. He's in the facilities, but that didn't matter. They continued fighting with no clear winner. The referees were trying to stop Carlos Colon. Carlos Colon, of course, hit them and went after Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody. It was a wild um, fight, brawl that it just encapsulate the hatred these four guys had against each other. This set up to what was believed to be the last match between both tag teams, the Super Cage match, where the victor was the first one to leave the cage. Sadly, there's no video of this match, same as the Anniversary 84 match. But at the end of a very bloody match celebrated in October 27, if both Juan Gonzalez and my mind are correct, at the end, Carlos leaves the cage to give the victory to the babyface, but this brought consequences as the heels closed the cage and did a 2-on-1 beatdown of Abdullah the Butcher into Carlos Colon was finally able to make the save. But Abdullah was pissed that Carlos Colon had left him, and this was the start of the catalyst to Abdullah the Butcher turning on Carlos Colon later in 1985. But and that was what everybody thought was the end of the feud. For many years, everybody considered that was the end of the trilogy. But 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 a couple of weeks ago, Matt Farmer discovered a fourth match between them to close 1984. That I was 50 years old when I discovered they had another one in December 22nd in a barbed wire match. Sadly, we don't know who won. We don't know what happened in that match because nobody knew about this match until a couple of weeks ago that Matt Farmer discovered the clippings for that match. And if somebody knows and has the video, please put it up in YouTube or put it in your page in Facebook or anywhere that you find. This feud to this day is super remembering the island. It's set up a couple of feuds for a couple of years. Believe it or not, it's set up the main event of Anniversary 85 with Carlos Colon versus Abdullah. It set up the continuation of the feud between Bruiser Brody versus Abdullah the Butcher, now with Bruiser Brody as a face, and it set up Stan Hansen versus Carlos Colon from the end of 86 to mid 87, based on the matches that happened during this feud. So, this feud between these four guys set up basically feuds for the next 2 years in the island, the glory years, and they were all very successful and they all made a lot of money for Capital Sports Promotions. Next week, we're going to take a look at a mid card feud, trying to figure out which one, but I promise you it's going to be a good one. I want to invite everybody to check out my YouTube page, de los Territorios per Wrestling Dom. Subscribe there. We're trying to get to 500 subscribers, so hopefully we will get there. And please subscribe to this podcast. And again, if you like it, please share it to your friends, people that might be interested in the history of wrestling in Puerto Rico. You could check me out also in my Spanish podcast, Desde los Territorios. We just celebrated 4 years, and I want to thank everybody who brought their regards and their nice words to it. So we have 174 episodes. We're going to be talking in Spanish about the Tito Santana versus Greg Valentine feud in WWF in 1984 all the way to 1985. Into next week when we come back with another stories from the last territory. Like I always say, sayonara, amigos.